All right, well, welcome to your class and to you, Dr. James, and anyone else who shows up here in a little bit to our brown bag session for undergraduate research. This is going to be a unique one because we haven't tried this before. So we're going to have you and your class participate. We are recording it. So, but if they have questions, you'll probably have to repeat them because I don't think we'll pick it up.
Sure.
So you'll let us know on that. And usually we do the talk and then have the question and answers afterwards. I do want to introduce you a little bit and let everybody know, although your class probably already knows this, that you are a valued member of the Philosophy and Religious Studies Department. You have received several awards for teaching and published. You're also right now the interim chair of Women and Gender Studies. And so we asked you to come in with your vast experience and talk to us about issues of diversity and inclusion in women and gender studies. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. I'm going to mute everything and welcome. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you so much for asking me to do it. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much to you and the Undergraduate Research Symposium Group and Cordell Moats, who is assisting everything today. You all do wonderful work, and it's wonderful to be here with you. The kinds of things that you do, I think, are so important and really have so much to do with how the issue is making a difference in the lives of so many students. And I'm hoping that it's only appropriate that we do this from the classroom with my Women's and Gender Studies 3000 class all being here right now. It is great to be here with you. What we're doing in our class right now, they're in between two different research papers. They've already completed their first research paper, so they've had some experience with research. And now we're going to go ahead and think a little bit more about what they might want to do for their second paper. And one of the things I wanted to make sure that I did today was give everybody a little bit of a chance to try and come up with some sort of a working definition of women's and gender studies research. Because different women's and gender studies people will do it quite differently. And one of the things that we need to be thinking about is this whole idea about what it might be in terms of the definition of what it is, a definition of what it is not. And if you think about this list, this is the kind of thing that a lot of women's and gender studies people might feel familiar with already. We're going to be avoiding doing meta-narratives and the idea of the winners writing the history books. One of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that it really is meaningful that we try and take a look at the life stories and the localized stories of people who have ended up having significant day-to-day insights. You may have noticed that the title of our class text is Everyday Women's and Gender Studies. It's about the idea that everyday experience and modern-day pop culture experience does matter, that we gain some kind of insight from that and do research about it. We try to avoid broad generalizations about groups. Instead, we want to appreciate and bring in insights from various groups. We want to try and acknowledge a lot of different kinds of experiences. We also try to avoid assumptions about what is quote-unquote normal. So women's and gender studies research often includes research about people with disabilities. And in our class, you all have seen some examples of that already. When it comes to the idea of majority rules or the idea that the majority is going to write the history books, that's also something that women's and gender studies tries to avoid. The non-dominant views are going to be the ones that are the most meaningful. And then we also have to think a little bit about the idea of what we assume about culture and what we assume about high culture. The idea that we're trying to pursue some vision of what high culture is and that only certain people can participate in it is not women's and gender studies. Women's and gender studies is trying to be more inclusive. And we're looking at the intersectionality of different questions about race, class, and gender. And everybody who's doing women's and gender studies and Africana studies starts out with a women's and gender studies class and starts out with that whole idea of race, class, and gender. So when we're thinking about this idea of what we're gaining when we do research, we also want to think a little bit about what we mean by real knowledge coming from research. We always hope that whenever we do a paper, we're creating new knowledge. We're bringing together information in new ways that people haven't seen before, so it's something new and something creative. The idea that the mind is somehow where people are gaining new information and that that's where real knowledge is something that women's and gender studies also wants to avoid. We're going to include insights from the body, insights from lived experience, insights from emotions, insights from social connections where there's different kinds of knowledge from different people who interact with each other. and the idea that we can understand the ethical importance of somebody's decision-making based on some of those feelings and not necessarily just on reason from the mind in the Western sense. So let me go ahead and give you some connections between different fields of study and the way that women's and gender studies might bring some new insights to it that we haven't seen, or maybe the way in which women's and gender studies has actually changed the history of those particular research areas. Here's an example with history and women's and gender studies. Back in the day, if you go back to the 50s, 40s, even further than that, the idea of history being the story of traditionally men who were leaders was the predominant idea about what studying history was. Instead, with women's and gender studies, we're bringing in different ideas about women being sources of knowledge, and we're not going to assume that all women have the same experiences. One example of this that actually caused quite a bit of interest in the history world back around the 1980s was Mary Boykin Chestnut. Mary Boykin Chestnut was the wife of a man who was a member of the constitutional government of the United States during the Confederacy, and she lived through this whole Civil War situation. In her diary, she wrote a number of insights about what was actually happening, and she really did talk honestly about what was happening between white men who owned slaves and how they were treating the women who they had as slaves. That history is something that only she would have been able to tell. The white men weren't necessarily running around telling people what they had been doing in this context. And now, ever since her diaries have become a part of the history way of doing research, people are writing about it. So at the bottom of this slide, you can see an entry from Galileo, from Academic Search Complete, where you can find people who have done research on her life, and the kinds of things that show that there are contradictions within what she did. In terms of her own diary, she's definitely talking about the problematic issues of slavery, but then she's also somebody who was heavily involved in movements for Confederate monuments. So it's not like we're going to be assuming that anybody is right, and we're not assuming that anybody is correct simply because they're a woman. We're looking at them as serious members of the historical story. Now, this idea of knowledge coming from different places, one of the analogies that I like to use is that there have been a number of ways in which knowledge and writing has been actually very inclusive in terms of women who occupy different positions within society, specifically socioeconomic positions. This is a set of books that were written by Barbara Neely about a character named Blanche. Blanche White is an African-American maid, and she is able to sort out murder mysteries because of her special knowledge as having been a maid or a custodian in family homes. If you stop and consider who knows the most about you, who would know if you were sick, or who would know if you were hiding evidence, the maid would be the one who would figure it out. This became such an interesting idea that people actually turned it into television shows. Esther Roll in the 1980s starred in a television show about a character named Mama Sykes, who was a housekeeper who was able to solve crimes. Her son is a New York police sergeant, and he kind of resents the fact that she's getting involved in his cases, but she's really good at it. And the idea that there was a story like this about Esther Roll acting before there was like Murder, She Wrote is an interesting moment in pop culture. And those moments in pop culture actually show us things that maybe we can't really explain in words. So Women's and Gender Studies is willing to look at these kinds of pop culture examples. If you want to have another example from a totally different context, in England, back in the day, there would have been servants who would be in great country houses, and they would be taking care of things. There's a film called Gosford Park, in which Helen Mirren plays the head maid of one of these households. And she actually knows more about every member of the family. By the end of the film, you realize that she really is the expert. She is the one who understands them and knows them better than they even know it themselves. Now, how about medical ethics situations? When it comes to medical ethics in women's and gender studies, there's a wide variety of topics that one could research. In one case, we have a historical example of a man named James Marion Sims, who was the man who invented the speculum. Anyone who's ever had to go to the OBGYN, to the gynecologist, the speculum is the instrument that they use to be able to view your cervix and do testing like pap smears. The way in which this instrument was invented and the history of it actually involves Sims having done some really potentially gruesome experiments on women who were being kept as slaves. One of the slaves who he was using in this way was a woman named Anarcha. And in Anarcha's situation, she is a woman who had been impregnated a number of times, been made to reproduce, and Sims was repeatedly examining her. And ever since then, there's been a lot of research coming out about what was actually happening in Sims's research methodology. And nowadays, we have people who review research processes and show that they are inappropriate or unethical. They try to acknowledge it in more detail. If you wanted to try and make a comparison with Anarcha, you could compare her with Henrietta Lacks, the woman who became famous as a result of the book The Secret Life of Henrietta Lacks and the film that came out afterwards. Research about Henrietta Lacks and the use of her cells from a cervical cancer sampling that was done, without her knowledge, her cells were so strong they could survive in the lab environment. They kept them going and used it for a variety of testing related to cervical cancer. And it's the kind of thing where the research that's come out about that, whether it's in journals like Nature or it's in journals that represent women's and gender studies and Africana studies, like NAMALA, the African American Review, those are the kinds of research items that one would use for the sake of an undergraduate research paper. Another example that we should definitely talk about, in our book for our class, we've had readings that dealt with questions of colonization and questions of medical treatment of people against their will. There's a variety of research out there that we could relate to some of the readings from our book, where we can talk about forced sterilization, whether it's Native American women or Latino women, people of underrepresented groups, people who are in groups that are not necessarily in power, but who have been taken advantage of by the medical establishment. Women's and gender studies research really opens the door for us to be able to talk about that and realize the truth about it in important ways. Now here's some information about women's and gender studies and sociology, psychology. How about the idea of cultural appropriation? In our class on Monday, we were talking about some different examples of cultural appropriation and co-optation. And I think it was really interesting. We had some great discussions about the idea of jeans. The denim jeans had traditionally been seen as a working class man's clothing because jeans would be able to withstand having to work on your knees, a number of other things. But then by the time of the 1970s, jeans were especially associated with designer jeans and being very expensive and being a kind of fashion statement. The idea that fashion itself is reflecting some of our understandings of culture and our misunderstandings of culture is something that you can also do research about. And here's just some examples. The Journal of Popular Culture is a journal that does these kinds of research items. And then Cultural Studies Critical Methodologies is another peer-reviewed journal that would do those kinds of articles too. I also think it's very interesting to consider this as it relates to Native American and Indigenous studies as well. You might be familiar with the comedy troupe, the 1491s. They have a sketch that touches on this called The Halloween Hell No. There's also some important articles that have come out about the misuse and misappropriation of the war bonnet. If you're familiar with Coachella, that's one of the music festivals where people sometimes think that it's okay to wear fashion that is associated with other cultures that they are not a part of. And they end up being insulting. They end up having it be rude because it's not something that's appropriate for them to do. How about the idea of gender and intercultural knowledge? One of the things that's going to be happening with women's and gender studies soon is that A.J. Ramirez will be taking on the role of being in charge of women's and gender studies. And it's the kind of situation where she wants to make sure that we are doing both women's issues as well as gender issues, issues of the LGBTQ community. And one of the things that we've talked about in our class is the idea of the indigenous third gender people, people who have two-spirit. And one of the things that was great, I've really enjoyed watching these videos that have been done before, and I believe that Dr. Knowles touched on this as well, that there is some really interesting research and material out there that one can find. The reason why I ended up looking into some of this myself, not just to get ready for our class, but there was also a student at Valdosta High School who was getting ready to do their AP exam, and they needed to find material about colonization and the way in which Central American indigenous people may experience third gender. And you'll notice that the name of the journal in this case is Men and Masculinities. So there is research out there that is wonderful to use for this kind of topic, for this kind of paper. And I think that that's definitely something that's interesting. And the other thing that we should think about, remember that first list about what women's and gender studies is and what it is not? We try and make sure that we are embracing a lot of different ways in which people experience their culture, a lot of different kinds of things that people might end up experiencing in life. Pornography and sex is something that is a legitimate women's and gender studies topic. So we should definitely consider that. One of our examples that we talked about in class was Buck Angel. Buck Angel is a trans man who has not had bottom surgery, and he is acting in pornography films. So the reading title that he gives to his piece in our class is The Power of My Vagina. So he has a vagina. Even that sentence itself might sound strange to some of us, but it's one of those kinds of examples where he's showing us that sexuality is something that can be empowering, depending on one's context. And the sexuality itself is imbued with a lot of different ways in which our culture and our society may give us, kind of pressure to behave in certain ways. And Buck Angel asks us to think about the different options that are out there. This is the textbook that we've been using in our class, and it's divided up in general into 5 different sections, and those are kind of good indicators for the different ways in which women's and gender studies people do research. I was the first one to use this book here at VSU, and since I used it, A.J. Ramirez also uses it in her WGST 3000 class. And when you look at the questions that we've considered here, equality and privilege, different levels of status in society, and bodies, the idea that the body itself is something that gives us a source of knowledge, and the way that we portray ourselves through our body is important. We can also look at the idea of places and locations where people live, where people are, not just what they think, but where they actually are living. And the way in which people are represented, like the fashion questions and all of those kinds of things that we talked about. Now, representations and then activism really do go together nicely, and we should definitely consider some examples of activism that might be related to women's and gender studies research. The main one that we talked about from our book, or that we will be talking about from our book in our next chapter, is the group Idle No More. Idle No More is a Canadian First Nations group which has been engaged in a number of different kinds of activism over the years, and they've made a wonderful contribution. Now, in terms of life here at VSU, you may be familiar with the Clothesline Project. That's when we have the t-shirts up around the pedestrian mall, and they say what somebody was wearing when they were sexually assaulted. That is done in concert with The Haven. And The Haven is the local women's shelter here in Valdosta. The Vagina Monologues was a long-standing tradition at VSU. It sort of fell by the wayside because of the COVID pandemic. The Vagina Monologues is a play by Eve Ensler. It originally came out in the 1980s, and my high school in Chicago actually did that production. And it is the kind of thing where they would have everybody memorize their part of the Vagina Monologues and then perform it. You could also look up film versions of the Vagina Monologues at places like Amazon Prime and Netflix if you're interested. And then you can also take part in these kinds of discussions that are organized by Sandra Jones, who is in charge of diversity and inclusion for VSU. She has also done one of these lunchtime sessions talking about different opportunities. And she's a great person to know. She was also an undergraduate with us in philosophy and religious studies. Also, I think it's actually a form of activism to make sure that you take classes in women's and gender studies, Native American, Indigenous studies, and African American studies, which is now Africana studies. Taking those classes means that you are willing to challenge what they tell you the canon of literature has to be. It means that you are expanding your mind in new ways, which is something it's great to do at college. And also keep in mind that it is that time to get registered and to make sure that you get an appointment with your advisor. If you've been over in Ashley Hall for those advising appointments, you may have noticed that there is a screen that has a rotating set of slides. One of those slides is for these lunchtime sessions about undergraduate research. Now, there's also a link to The Haven, and there's also the Mary Turner website. The story of Mary Turner is a very important story. It's a part of South Georgia history that we don't want to lose. We don't want to forget it. Mary Turner was an African-American woman who was lynched here in South Georgia, outside of Hayhira. And then, of course, there's the American Association of University Women. If you click that link, there's a very goofy picture of me there with 3 of the other ladies who are part of the group. We do 2 major activism events during each academic year. We have a political forum every fall where the political candidates come and present their stump speeches. It's kind of like a League of Women's Voters thing. We don't really advocate one candidate or the other, but we give everybody an equal chance to talk. And then in the spring, we do something called Sister to Sister. Some of you here in the room may have even taken part in Sister to Sister. Everybody goes over to the University Center for a full day of sessions, talking about different issues in school, like bullying, how to get along with each other, what kinds of things you should or shouldn't do on the internet. And those middle school girls who come to that very often will come to VSU for college later. So that can be pretty handy. Now, there's also grants that people can get. Right now, I'm involved with the Political Science Department on a TEAL grant, which is about education for American civic life. That grant means that for a month during the summer of 2022, we're going to have a group of high school students who come to VSU and get to read a wide range of variety of readings about different political issues from different points of view. And we're going to end up having those students being encouraged to get into dialogue about what a good civic engagement life should be. And I'm also involved with the Odom Library faculty on a Let's Talk About It grant for women's and suffrage issues, suffrage and the Voting Rights Act, the 19th Amendment, and that history. Now, I also wanted to just make sure that I closed out with a sample of different examples of students who have done women's and gender studies research presentations here at VSU. So this is my last slide. I just wanted to make sure that I got a chance to give a shout out to some of these students. The top one you see there from Kelsey Leah Morton, she was in this Women's and Gender Studies 3000 class when she read the article by C.J. Pascoe in our book and decided that she wanted to do research about the labeling that goes on in terms of the words like fag or oh that's gay that high school students and junior high students will sometimes say to each other. And it turned into an undergraduate research presentation for her with the undergraduate research group that Dr. Laverne and Cordell Moats are working with for this particular presentation series that I'm very, very happy to be a part of. Thank you. So let me go ahead and stop screen sharing, and then we can do questions, anything that you might like to ask about, anybody in the room who has questions or anybody online who has questions.
Well, maybe I'll throw you a question first. What are some of the difficulties that you've seen with students doing research in this area?
Boy, that's a great question. I think that there's a certain way in which when you first come into one of these classes, because we are trying to be so many things for so many people, we're trying to be so inclusive and so diverse. Somebody might come in expecting that, you know, my experience as a white woman should be the one that we're talking about, or my experience as a black woman should be the one that we're talking about. And it usually doesn't work out that that one perspective is the only one that you should focus on. So you have to be pluralistic. You have to acknowledge different people's experiences. You know, you might have a student who comes into a women's and gender studies class and doesn't realize that there's going to be some ideas about colonization and Native American issues. And so it might be news to them that that is something that, you know, is important and that is something that is intersectional that relates to women's and gender studies.
Wonderful, thank you. I hope your class has some questions.
Yeah, what kinds of questions do you all have? Are you starting to think about your next paper? Did you see anything today that you might want to know more about or look into more? Feel free to speak up and I'll repeat your question for the group watching.
Yeah, they might be a little shy because they're being taped, but we can't see them.
Yes, that's right. We can't see you, so we won't know who you are. That's right. Were any of you surprised that there were situations like the situation of Henrietta Lacks before that in history? That there have been women used in the history of gynecology and making the spectrum? And depending on your own family background, you may feel like you've had good experiences with healthcare, or you may feel very doubtful about the medical establishment. And I totally want to acknowledge that you have good reasons for either one.
Dr. James, do you have anyone right now working on undergraduate research projects?
Okay, is there anybody in the room who is currently currently working on an undergraduate research project, whether it's for our class or for another class in your major, because I know we're a minor program. So if you have something going on in your major that you're working on, and I know that you have done this before, so feel free to tell us about what you've done before too. Just speak up. Yeah.
I'm doing my senior seminar right now, and I'm working on The Tenet of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, and how she uses different narratives. She writes in a man's perspective and a woman's perspective, and how their views on things like religion and gossip and stuff differ for each perspective.
Excellent. I don't know if everyone could hear that. She's working on Anne Bronte. It sounds like it's an English class that your work is coming from, an ENGL class. And when you do the Bronte sisters, they definitely have this way of mastering different voices of different people in different levels or different occupations or different places in society for the sake of their writing. So that's interesting. I think that that's the kind of pluralism that women's and gender studies tries to aim for. Yeah. Did you find out anything new about women's and gender studies from being in our class that you didn't know before? Did you have any assumptions about what it was? Yes.
I definitely thought that it would be more women-based instead of including nearly every topic of diversity and inclusivity.
Yeah, that's a great point. You thought that it would be more specifically about women. And then it's so much about plurality and diversity in general. Even looking at the table of contents of our book, it's sort of like there's people in this table of contents who are men, there's people in this table of contents who are indigenous men, there's people in the table of contents who are, a variety of different backgrounds. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who might assume that that's women's studies. And I think that you would probably be right if it were like the 1970s, the 1980s, and it was the beginning of women's studies. At the very beginning, it was primarily focused specifically on women, and especially white women who were privileged enough to go to college. So we've got to acknowledge that there's a certain amount of like the social class thing about how we study what we study. We've tried to expand that since then. And the whole idea of it being not just women's studies, but women's and gender studies is a part of what I was mentioning for Dr. Ramirez coming in as the new director for us. It's going to be the kind of thing where we have to look at gender roles, and we have to look at questions of masculinity as well as questions of femininity. So remember a long time ago we talked about feminine ethics and the whole idea of feminine and feminist. There's an assumption out there, even among feminism, that there's this idea that there's just one kind of feminism. Really, there's multiple types of feminism, and there's a long history of how it evolved. From liberal feminism to radical feminism to socialist feminism to Marxist feminism, sex-positive feminism. There's all different kinds. And that is something that's kind of neat about being in college. You get to find out about the varieties. And I'm definitely willing to have you focus on whatever you find most interesting for the sake of your papers. The other thing that we have coming up is the Southeastern Women's Studies Association and Gender Studies Association. They're having a meeting. The deadline for papers to be submitted for that is in November. So anybody who's interested in submitting their first paper from our class for that, you are welcome to do so. Yes. We always like to have students getting involved in undergraduate research. And that's something that Dr. Laverne really does in an amazing way. She's had wonderful students doing wonderful presentations all over the state and nationally.
Well, we couldn't do any of that without people like you on the faculty to support the program.
Oh, thank you so much. And I really enjoyed seeing the other people who were presenting during these lunchtime sessions. I think it's a fantastic brown bag series that you've all put together, and I learned so much from all of them.
Wonderful. They've been great fun to do, and I can sense that your class is a little bit shy to speak up, and that's fine. So what I think we'll do is call it to close so that you can actually have a discussion with your class, and they won't feel like they're being taped or put down for posterity.
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah, no problem, no problem.
But I really appreciate you doing this. I loved your presentation and learning everything about it. And I hope you'll come back with us sometime and talk about your own research.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation. You guys have a wonderful day.
All right, you too. Thank you, your class.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.